Somewhere at the bottom of a Peak District reservoir, there is a road. It has walls. It has a bridge. No car has driven it in more than 80 years, and nobody built a barrier to stop them because nobody needed to. The water did that instead, 50 feet of it, permanent, deliberate, on purpose. Most summers, you will never see this road at all. Then, once in a while, the water drops low enough and Britain gets its ghost back. Ask yourself what kind of decision closes a perfectly good road forever, on purpose, with water standing in for a barrier. Hold that question. This is the story of Derwent Dam. 1. What the drought gives back. Walk the shoreline of Lady Bower Reservoir in a normal year and there is nothing to see but water, conifer plantations climbing the valley sides, and the long grey wall of the dam itself. Nothing suggests a road ever ran through here. Nothing suggests anyone ever lived here. The reservoir looks the way reservoirs always look, permanent, natural, as if the valley had simply always been full. Then a summer comes without enough rain, and the surface starts to fall. First inches, then feet, then the unmistakable outline of stonework breaking through, dark and slick, exactly where the maps insist nothing should be. In 1995, in 1976, in 2018, and again in 2022, the water dropped far enough to expose the Packhorse Bridge that once carried the road across the river at the bottom of the valley. Its arch stays intact, its stones barely worn, considering how long it has actually existed. Alongside it, low walls and building footings emerge from the silt foundations of a village that hasn't had a resident since the Second World War. Local news crews and amateur photographers alike treat each of these droughts as an event in its own right, arriving with drones and cameras the moment word spreads that the water has dropped enough to matter. What they capture rarely changes much from one drought to the next. The same bridge, the same low walls, the same pattern of stones pressed into the mud. Even so, the fact that it keeps reappearing at all is what draws people back every single time. Generation after generation of amateur historians documenting the same handful of stones as though seeing them for the first time. Older photographs from the 1970s and 1990s show almost identical scenes to the ones taken in 2018 and 2022. The same bridge, angled the same way, framed by the same receding waterline. Nothing about the ruin itself has changed in 50 years. What changes is only who is standing there looking at it. One more generation catching a glimpse of something their grandparents also once stood and photographed. 2. The valley before the water. To understand what the drought is actually showing you, rewind past all of it, past the reservoir, past the dam, back to a working valley with 2 villages in it. Derwent and Ashopton sat on the floor of the upper Derwent Valley, ordinary Peak District communities with a church, a pub, farms, and a road connecting them to each other and to the wider region beyond. An old stone Packhorse Bridge carried that road across the river. None of this was remarkable. It was simply a place people lived, the way people had lived in that valley for generations. Census records and local histories describe farming families, small tradespeople, and a rhythm of life built around the church calendar and the seasons. Nothing that marked these villages out as unusual anywhere in rural Derbyshire. There was no sense among the people living there, right up until the announcements began, that Derwent and Ashopton were any different from 100 other small communities scattered across the Peak District, quietly going about their business a long way from the decisions being made about them in distant offices. Children walked that road to school. Farmers drove livestock across that bridge on market days, generation after generation, without a single one of them imagining the valley itself might one day be considered expendable. The village of Derwent even had its own manor house, Derwent Hall, along with a scattering of farms spread across the surrounding hillsides, a genuinely established community rather than a cluster of a few isolated cottages. Ashopton, smaller but no less permanent in the minds of the people who lived there, sat close enough that the 2 villages functioned almost as a single community split across the valley floor. Neither place had any reason to think of itself as temporary. Villages like this existed all across the Peak District, and nothing about Derwent or Ashopton's daily life distinguished them from any of their neighbours who would go on to survive the century completely undisturbed. Nothing was wrong with Derwent or Shopton. No disaster had struck them, no economic collapse had hollowed them out, no engineering flaw threatened the road or the bridge that served them. They were healthy villages on the day someone decided, from an office many miles away, that they would have to disappear. The decision had nothing to do with the villages themselves and everything to do with what sat downstream of them, cities that had already outgrown the water supply built to serve them and were about to outgrow it again. This is worth sitting with because it inverts the usual story of abandonment. Most dead roads and dead villages fail on their own terms, outcompeted by a bypass, hollowed out by an industry leaving town, left behind when the economy simply moved on without them. Derwent and Shopton didn't fail at anything. They were functioning exactly as villages are supposed to function right up until the decision to erase them was made entirely elsewhere. 3. The thirsty cities. Sheffield's expansion in the Industrial Revolution had already forced one major solution upstream of Derwent and Shopton. Between 1901 and 1916, engineers built the Howden and Derwent dams, flooding the upper reaches of the valley to create two large reservoirs feeding water south into Sheffield, Derby, Leicester and Nottingham. It was an enormous undertaking for its time, an entire construction town called Birchenley built from scratch just to house the workers, and when it was finished, it seemed like it might be enough. Thousands of navvies lived in Birchenley for the duration of the project, a temporary settlement complete with its own shops, a school and even a small hospital, entirely built to serve a workforce that would disperse the moment the dams were finished. It was, in its own right, a remarkable feat of turn of the century engineering, proof that the region could solve its water problems with enough ambition and enough labour. Nobody building it in 1916 imagined they were laying the groundwork for a third, far more disruptive project just 2 decades later. The scale of the first 2 dams alone should have felt like more than enough water for a generation. Derwent Dam and Howden Dam together created reservoirs capable of supplying millions of gallons a day to cities that, at the time, seemed nowhere close to needing more. Engineers of the era spoke about the project in the language of permanence, a system built to serve the region for the foreseeable future, not a first phase in something larger still to come. That confidence would not survive contact with the 20th century's pace of urban growth. It wasn't enough. By the 1930s, the cities the Derwent Valley Waterworks served had kept growing, and demand had once again caught up with supply. Engineers looked back at the same valley and identified a third site, further downstream this time, exactly where Derwent and Shopton stood. A new reservoir here, Ladybower, would connect to the existing system and meaningfully expand the region's water capacity for decades to come. The villages were not consulted in any meaningful sense. Compulsory purchase orders moved through Parliament, land was acquired, and residents were informed, not asked, that they would need to leave. There was no referendum, no local vote, no mechanism by which the people of Derwent and Shopton could have overruled a decision made almost entirely on paper by engineers and officials working from maps and rainfall projections rather than any direct sense of what the valley actually meant to the people living in it. 4. The valley goes under. Construction on Ladybower Dam began in 1935 and continued for 8 years through the build-up to war and well into the middle of it. Buildings in Derwent and Shopton were stripped of anything reusable and largely demolished ahead of the flooding, though accounts describe the church tower left standing even as the water began to rise around it, a visible landmark right up until the reservoir finally closed over it completely. Crowds are said to have gathered to watch that moment happen, the last visible piece of a village disappearing beneath water that would not fully drain again for the rest of the century, except in drought. Wartime construction schedules complicated the project further. Materials and labour stretched thin by a country fighting on multiple fronts, yet the work continued regardless, treated as essential infrastructure even while so much else in Britain was rationed or delayed. Photographs from those final months show a landscape in a strange state of transition, half village, half building site, half already underwater, a place being actively erased while ordinary wartime life carried on everywhere around it. There is something almost unbearable about the timing. Britain in the early 1940s was a country fighting for its survival, its attention consumed by the war effort, rationing, and the constant threat of invasion. And in the middle of all of it, resources were still found, deliberately, to finish flooding a valley that had done nothing to threaten the war effort at all. The project didn't pause for the war. If anything, the water supply it promised only made it more essential in the eyes of the officials overseeing it. One more reason the villages below could not be granted any more time than they'd already been given. The road went the same way as everything else. The packhorse bridge that had carried traffic across the valley floor for generations was left in place and simply submerged, along with the tarmac and stone walls that had defined it as a road at all. This wasn't decay. This wasn't a structure left to crumble through neglect the way most abandoned British infrastructure eventually does. It was a fully functional road, in good repair, deliberately and permanently drowned on a set timetable, because the water above it mattered more to the people making the decision than the road itself ever could. Nobody debated whether the bridge might be preserved above the new waterline, moved, or rebuilt somewhere safer. It simply wasn't considered worth the extra effort. One small structure among many being sacrificed to a much larger engineering project that had no patience for sentiment. 5. Built to replace, never to reopen. Somewhere had to carry the traffic that road once handled, and the answer was built above the coming waterline rather than through it. The new A57 and the Ashopton Viaduct were constructed on higher ground, rerouting the region's traffic up and around the valley the old road used to cross directly. Drivers adapt quickly, the way people always adapt to a new route once the old one stops being an option. Within a generation, most travellers through the area had no reason to know a different road had ever existed at all. The viaduct itself became, in time, a landmark in its own right, photographed and admired by visitors with no idea it existed specifically because an older, lower crossing had been sacrificed to make way for the reservoir beneath it. Maps redrawn after the 1940s simply showed the new route as though it had always been there. No dotted line marking the old road's former path, no asterisk explaining what had happened to the crossing it replaced, just a clean, updated picture of a valley that had quietly rewritten its own geography. Engineers and planners of the time treated the transition as a straightforward technical problem rather than the erasure of a place people had called home. A new crossing was needed, a new crossing was built, and the project moved on to its next milestone. There was no equivalent effort made to preserve any physical trace of the older route on land, no marker at the viaduct explaining what it had replaced, no acknowledgement built into the new infrastructure that an older, lower road had once served exactly the same purpose a few dozen feet below the waterline. This is what makes Derwent's old road unusual even among Britain's abandoned infrastructure. Most closed roads and dead railways fail slowly, outcompeted, defunded, made obsolete by something faster or cheaper built elsewhere. This road did none of that. It was closed instantly and completely at a specific moment by a specific decision with absolutely no intention of it ever functioning again. It wasn't beaten by time. It was erased on purpose, on schedule, to make room for something the planners considered more valuable than the villages and the road it had always served. Every other tunnel or road in this kind of story eventually gets a choice to put in front of it somewhere down the line. Demolish it, restore it, repurpose it, leave it to rot and see what happens. Derwent's road never got that choice, because the decision was made before it was ever closed. There was no period of decline to watch, no slow abandonment anyone could have intervened in, no moment where a different outcome might have been possible. 6. A war fought over a grave. While the water was still rising over Derwent and Ashopton, an entirely different kind of history was unfolding on the reservoirs just upstream. In the spring of 1943, the RAF's 617 Squadron practiced the low-level bombing runs that would become the Dam Busters raid, flying repeated sorties directly over the completed Howden and Derwent reservoirs, refining the technique that would let their bouncing bombs skip across water toward Germany's dams weeks later. Almost the same stretch of valley, doing almost the opposite job at almost the same time. A few miles downstream, engineers were finishing the job of erasing a village and its road beneath rising water. A few miles upstream, air crews were training over water that already existed, practicing precision destruction aimed at dams built by someone else's engineers for someone else's war. Nobody involved in either project was thinking about the other. But for a handful of years in the early 1940s, this one Peak District valley was simultaneously the site of a village being deliberately drowned for peacetime water supply and a rehearsal ground for one of the most famous bombing raids in British history. Two entirely different uses of the same idea: water as a weapon in one case and water as infrastructure in the other. Picture the geography honestly for a moment. The pilots of 16 Squadron flew low over Howden and Derwent reservoirs, mastering a bombing technique built entirely around the physics of water, bouncing a weapon across a lake's surface toward a target. Just downstream, in the same valley system, an entirely different kind of water engineering was quietly finishing the job of submerging a village nobody in the cockpits above was thinking about. Two water stories, one built to destroy German dams, one built to supply British cities, running in parallel through the same hills at the same moment in history. Neither one aware of how strange it would look, decades later, to have happened in exactly the same place. The road was never beaten by traffic, weather, or time. It was closed because Britain decided the water on top of it mattered more than the road underneath it, and it never once reconsidered that choice. Every drought that reveals the old bridge is really just the valley briefly refusing to keep the secret. If you've stood on that bridge during a drought, or your family came from Derwent or a Shopton, tell us what you remember in the comments. And if you want more stories like this one, hit subscribe. We dig up a new hidden piece of history every week.